Galilee, where this story takes place, is known for sudden storms that sweep down along the edge of the mountains and fill the valley where the Sea of Galilee is in with lightning storms and thunderstorms and waves and wind. And here we have the disciples, these fishermen, afraid of this storm that's come along. And Jesus, all the while, during this storm, is asleep in the back of the boat. Let's take a look at the passage again. Suddenly a windstorm struck the lake, waves started splashing into the boat, and it was about to sink. Jesus was in the back of the boat, his head on a pillow. He was asleep. His disciples had to wake him up, and they said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Pretty amazing that Jesus, asleep in the midst of this storm, even though the disciples are feverishly working to keep the boat going. I was wondering, would you be able to stay asleep in the middle of a storm on the Sea of Galilee? I need some volunteers for this next part of the sermon. I need some volunteers. Yep, come right up. Anybody else? Yep, come right up. Yep, come right up. Anybody else? Yep, come right up. Yep, come right up. I'm going to have you all stand in a line right here, shoulder to shoulder. Okay, now your job in this game is to go to sleep, close your eyes, head on a pillow, head on a pillow. Show me your pillow. Show me eyes closed. You're going to have to stay asleep no matter what happens. Don't open your eyes. Oh, here come the wind and the waves. I think there was some splashing involved, too. The wind and the waves, here they come. Everybody's still asleep. All right, can we give them a hand? Great job. Find your seats. Well, now those volunteers, they stayed asleep through the wind and the waves, just like Jesus did. But I don't know if it's just me. Maybe you too have always been troubled by the notion in this story that Jesus is asleep during the disciples' crisis, that he had his head on a pillow, and they even said to him, "Don't you care whether or not we drown?" Has it ever troubled you in this story that Jesus, in the midst of his disciples, his friends, he's their leader, in the midst of their crisis, in the midst of their storm, he's asleep? And it leads us to question with fear and trembling whether Jesus is asleep on our storms and our crises. A couple things to say about that. First of all, Jesus does wake up and deal with the storm ever so effectively. He does. But second of all, I think this story might be giving us a glimpse into the way that we relate with the risen Christ. The story is most certainly about Jesus in the boat, and maybe it's also giving us a future glimpse about how we relate to the risen Christ. And the point that it might be making is just this, that the risen Christ does not participate in our anxiety. The risen Christ is not consumed by our crisis because he is immune to anxiety. Let me tell you a little bit about what I mean. Let me tell you a little bit about anxiety. We all have anxiety in our lives. And kids, if you're wondering what the word anxiety means, anxiety is like how you feel on the first day of school, or anxiety is like how you feel at the doctor's office when you're about to get a shot. That's anxiety. For me, I was trying to remember a time of anxiety, and it was in Virginia when we were having renovations done on our house. You never know what the contractor is going to find. You never know what the contractor is going to charge. And there is anxiety, and for me, there was anxiety as we were going through this week, 2-week, 3-week long process of renovations on our house. And I knew it was bad when I started developing itchy, flaky scalp. And I looked up on some website or the other, and I was like, what's going on here? It said, well, itchy, flaky scalp can be brought on by stress. I said, oh, check. There we go. Now, we do a funny thing when we are going through times of anxiety. Well, we do a couple things. Sometimes we sort of bring it all into ourselves and just tie it in a big knot and hold on to it. But other times, we do this funny thing where we try to get other people to, join us in our anxiety. So, I'll just be talking to somebody, having a conversation, and then out of nowhere you say, oh, well, I got to get home to meet the contractor. Oh, I didn't mention we're having renovations done on our house. Yeah, it's really, It's just sort of trying to draw this person in to what we're going through, maybe in a way to have them sort of join in our anxiety. It might feel good at the time, but actually it's not really what we want. I mean, we want to share our experiences with others, but if we're anxious and then we make somebody else anxious, well, then you've just got two anxious people together. It's kind of like with water safety. What do we always know if somebody is drowning? What's the worst thing that you can do to help that person who's drowning? Anybody know? Yeah, the worst thing you can do is just jump right in and meet them face to face. Because what are they going to do? They'll just grab onto you, and then all of a sudden you've got two people drowning. No, they teach us in lifeguarding class or water safety that you extend to them, a flotation device or whatever you have, extend something to them so they can be drawn in. Sometimes we try to do this with God. We try to do this with Jesus in our prayers. We try to, draw Jesus into our anxiety and say, Jesus, I'm really in crisis here. I want you to be in crisis too. Well, that's not what we want. What we need is the Jesus, the risen Christ, who is the rock. The Jesus who is the risen Christ, who is the one stable thing in this situation that we can grab onto and have as our rock, as our stronghold, as the only one who can be immune from anxiety. Try to give another example. You have to imagine a child being cared for by a doctor or a nurse or a parent who has chickenpox. So imagine a child with chickenpox, and a doctor or a nurse is caring for them. And from the outside looking in, you might say, whoa, how can that parent or doctor or nurse be so calm in caring for this kid who has a highly contagious disease? Okay, chickenpox is pretty contagious, and it's pretty bad. And you'd look at it and say, well, how can this person be so gentle and calm and so close and intimate with this other human being which has a highly contagious disease? But of course, what you would know is that that adult already had chickenpox. And so that adult is immune to getting chickenpox. The adult is not even thinking about possibly getting chickenpox because he or she knows that it can't get it. And so they can be gentle and intimate and present with this child, knowing that that chickenpox, no matter how bad it is, cannot affect them. And so it is with the risen Christ. We say in our prayers, oh God, I'm in crisis. Come on, get into me with this crisis. And Jesus is like, hey, I'm present with you, but no, I'm not going to be swept up in your anxiety. I'm not going to be swept up in your crisis, not because it's my choice, but just because I can't. I am unable to be swept into anxiety or crisis because of who I am, because of who the risen Christ is and what the risen Christ has done. He cannot. He is unable, he is immune to be drawing in to our anxiety and our crisis. And in fact, that is exactly what we need at that moment. And it is because of that immunity that Jesus can rise up as he did in the boat with the disciples and say, be still. He commands the winds and the waves, be still. And it's a fascinating thing about the way the Bible works. These same words are the words that Jesus usually uses when he casts a demon out of somebody. When he is in a situation where somebody is possessed by an evil spirit and Jesus casts out that spirit out of the turmoil, he says, "Be still." And he says the same thing to the wind and the waves, "Be still." Psalm 41, "Be still and know that I am God." This story of Jesus in the boat calming the storm, it ends with a narrative of recognition. You see, the disciples, after they watch Jesus calm the storm, they say this following line: "Who is this that the waves and the wind obey his command? Who is this?" You see, the disciples knew something about weather, and they also knew something about the Bible and the Old Testament. They knew that the only person or being in the Hebrew Bible who can command and control the waves is Yahweh, is God. And here we're most specifically looking at the book of Exodus, where Moses and the Israelites have gotten out of Egypt, and they arrive at the Red Sea, and sure enough, somehow, some way, they were able to cross through on dry ground because Yahweh commands the winds and the waves. So here are the disciples in the boat in this glassy sea after the storm, and they're looking at their quirky rabbi leader in the boat who's just calmed a storm, and they're thinking about Yahweh in the Old Testament who commanded the winds and the waves, quirky rabbi leader, Yahweh, God of the universe, and they're kind of like, huh? Could it be? Who is this that he can command the wind and the waves? It becomes a narrative of recognition where they recognize the power of Jesus Christ in their very midst, the power of God in their very midst. You know, there's a show on television these days called Undercover Boss. I've only seen it a couple times, and I've heard it's kind of gone in a different direction, but at the beginning it was really good. It was this idea of a CEO or a major boss of a corporation taking on a disguise and then going around and meeting with various people from the company. And so you've got an oil executive in the tanks cleaning out, the oil tanks and meeting these different employees, and they don't know that it's the boss. Of course, at the end, the boss, takes off the disguise and reveals himself or herself to the employees, and they're always, stunned that here was the boss who was here with us the whole time. It's kind of like that in this story, that Jesus is revealed as the undercover boss to the disciples. Although for us, we don't need any revealing. The risen Christ has already been revealed for us. The risen Christ is revealed for us. And so we need not be confused about his identity, but rather we can put our energy into fellowshipping with the risen Christ and being present with the risen Christ and allowing ourselves to be drawn closer and closer to the risen Christ. This is one of the key elements of the Christian journey, the imitation of Christ, the relationship with Christ, the drawing closer and closer that we may almost be fused with his person and power, so that when we are present with him, extraordinary things can happen and storms can be calmed. I have a quick story that I'll sort of close up with. I was on a trip one time with my aunt and uncle and cousins. And my aunt and my cousin Andrew were not getting along too well, as mothers and sons sometimes don't when they're on vacation. And it was right before dinner. There was some argument over something being cleaned up or not being cleaned up, and it got a little bit heated, and somebody said, "I hate you." And it was right before dinner. Well, we sat down, and the meal was prepared, and we were about to pray. Now, let me tell you, nobody at that table wanted to pray at that moment. There wasn't exactly the right context for people to be praying, but it was a tradition that my aunt and uncle had always set that no matter what happens, you pray before dinner. So there we were, and everyone kind of looked around and was like, "Oh, I'm not praying." But finally, Andrew went ahead and said, okay, let's bow our heads, and said a real quick prayer, just, Jesus, thank you for this food. Thank you that, Cousin Matt is here. Amen. And we all raised our heads and opened our eyes, and it was like all the tension had just been swept out of the room. It was like the whole storm that was going on had just been alleviated, the pressure that was building up. And somebody said, I'm sorry. And then somebody else said, I'm sorry. And then we had a nice meal. Now, the storm had happened, and the words were not taken back. But it was amazing how, with just the presence of Christ on our lips, the whole atmosphere of the house had changed, and the storm had been alleviated. And so it is that we find ourselves present with the risen Christ. And when we find ourselves present with the risen Christ, we recognize him. We recognize him as the one who has all the credentials and all the power and all the love for us. That he can say the words that we are longing to hear. Be still. Be still. Be still.